Okay, well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for being here on this kind of gray and cold morning after the gorgeous fall day we had yesterday. I'm Alondra Nelson. I'm president of the Social Science Research Council, and it's my pleasure and my honor to thank you and to welcome you to this conversation about an issue confronting us all in many facets of our lives as citizens and as scholars, as policymakers, and the like. Science and technology permeates almost every interaction in our society today, and the question that we face is how can we ensure that knowledge generated by social scientists best serves the common good in this moment and in this changing context for the work that we do. The Social Science Research Council has been helping to address pressing questions like this one for nearly a century. Since our founding in 1923, the Council has supported scholars, shaped research agendas, and mobilized knowledge for the benefit of the public at large. Our aim was then and is today to deploy the most excellent and rigorous research and to galvanize leading thinkers to grapple with some of the largest public issues of our time, and we're delighted to have some of those leading thinkers here with us today. Today, the Council continues to build on this nearly 100-year tradition by pioneering new modes of knowledge production and collaboration. Social scientists now operate in a dramatically different research ecosystem than the one that existed nearly a half a century ago. This morning, we gathered to consider the questions that are at the heart of our new initiative that we called MediaWell. Like many citizens, we are concerned to better understand how democracy and its discontents, or its anxieties, as we put it in another one of our SSRC programs, are operating today. We are motivated in our work at the SSRC by a deep concern about whether the central institutions of political life, including and especially today, mass media, can continue to support democracy. As social media has become vital to political discourse, scholars ranging from data scientists to historians have begun investigating unreliable information and its implications for our democracies. The MediaWell initiative builds on the Council's long tradition of both field building and agenda setting in the social sciences. Promoting research excellence for the generation to come will require, on our part, on all of our parts really, a kind of constant recalibration and renewal of our work. So as we think about the disruption happening as a kind of externality to society, we also have to be nimble in the way we think about doing our work as scholars and policymakers. As we move into a new century of work at the SSRC, the Council remains committed to creating the conditions for better understanding of shared social challenges in this moment. MediaWell has already helped to bolster and consolidate the field of disinformation researchers, and we've already found uses for the work of this platform here on nearby Capitol Hill. We've been really delighted to have some of you in the room and also some of our colleagues working in the political realm be beta testers for the site early on, and it's clearly already having some benefit. We hope that you and your communities will continue to find this tool useful for the myriad work that you do to secure our democracies. So thank you and welcome again. And allow me to introduce Dr. Jason Roady, who is the director of many things at the SSRC, including the Media Democracy Program where MediaWell is housed.
Good morning, everyone. We're incredibly delighted that you're here. We're especially delighted to be able to put this out into the public, MediaWell, which we've been working on for several months. At this time, I'd like to introduce Sam Spies and Michael Miller, who are going to come up and introduce MediaWell to you, after which I'll give a few brief remarks, and then we'll move on to the main centerpiece of our morning, which is our esteemed panel. So Sam and Mike, thanks so much.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to be brief, but I want to begin by recognizing the brilliant work of two of my colleagues, Sam Spies to my left and Adriana Di Silvestro, each of whom has been working tirelessly to shepherd MediaWell into the world. And I will have the opportunity in the near future to congratulate them when MediaWell is a success and cited by scholars and policymakers, but I just want to take an opportunity today to thank them for their great work on this. The site we're launching today was originally known as the Disinformation Research Mapping Initiative, a long name that is, if laborious, also quite explicative. Because the goal of MediaWell is to map a field of study as it emerges, as scholars, researchers, and journalists delineate, on the one hand, an emergent sphere of social life, the so-called information order or disorder, if you will. On the other hand, an emergent logic of political interaction, one that leverages dis, mis, and malinformation for political gain. And like other SSRC projects, MediaWell will take a synoptic view of social science research to draw connections between variegated disciplines and subfields, and to limn the contours of a field of study that does not and probably cannot reside within a single discipline, nor even within the academy. It's difficult to create something new, and I think even more so to create something special, but I think we're doing both here. MediaWell is not simply going to be a platform for mapping disinformation research, but a modular framework for tracking, organizing, and mobilizing new research for the public good. And so, without any more ado, I want to turn it over to my colleague, Sam Spies, who is Program Officer for the Media and Democracy Program and the lead writer of our live research reviews. Sam was trained as an anthropologist and also worked for many years as a journalist, so he's the right man for the job, and we're really excited and happy about the work that he's done.
Thanks,
So,
Mike.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for joining us this morning. So the public-facing aspect of MediaWell is a new web platform which we launched publicly late last night. Briefly, MediaWell is both an exercise in public scholarship, and it's the SSRC's answer to concerns within the emerging field of disinformation studies. Why is the project necessary? First, there's a huge volume of scholarship emerging across academic disciplines, from anthropology to psychology. Between and within these disciplines, there are a lot of different definitions and typologies that are being used. We also want to help address the very slow pace of academic publishing. MediaWell is designed to be able to amplify research that's presented at events like these and conferences, as well as material that comes out in white papers and non-traditional sources. And lastly, we want to help identify gaps in research and help people avoid overlapping efforts. How does MediaWell work? The site is built to address rapid growth and curate research and content as it emerges. With our events calendar and our scholarly profiles, we're helping to build an interdisciplinary scholarly community. Lastly, and most importantly to me personally, we're translating academic publications for a broad audience of policymakers, students, citizens, and journalists. Getting to the nitty-gritty, all of the content on the site is sorted into one or more research topics, and these we've developed with input from our academic advisory board. We have the flexibility to add to these as the field evolves. We're focusing our content initially on what we see as the foundations, things like defining disinformation, contexts of misinformation, and how misinformation spreads. The site features a variety of content types. I'll touch on some of these more in a moment, but for now I'll say that in our Zotero database, we're up to 900 citations and growing, sorted into our topics and searchable by their abstracts. So for those of you who teach, when your students tell you in a couple of weeks that they can't find material for their final papers, please send them our way. Each of our research topics gets a dedicated live research review. These are literature reviews that we're aiming at an undergraduate reading level. Our goal is to be academically rigorous but broadly accessible. And we call them live because we'll be updating them as research emerges, with a versioning system to keep them both archived and citable persistently on the web. We're also featuring expert reflections. These are op-ed essays that describe the state of the field, make predictions for the near future, and offer informed policy recommendations. These are written by our advisory board members, and we are thrilled to be working with this group of people. We have left 3 spots open on the board to fill gaps in expertise as the project develops and as the field develops. Our network of editors at large is crucial to our content aggregation mission. Editors at large, with 2 clicks, can send articles, news content, events, and citations using a simple browser bookmarklet. And 2 clicks sends that content directly into our curation stream. We hope that you'll all consider signing up. We want to ensure that we're as comprehensive as we can be, and our carefully curated crowdsourcing is crucial to that. Lastly, our scholar profiles offer a place for users of the site to see who's working on what. The sample screenshot is not yet fully populated because all of this material is in the hands of the user. But these profiles link to publications in our database. You can show ORCID and Twitter information if you choose, and they can also be sorted by focus tags. Users can decide what, if any, information they want to display. Wrapping up, we're very eager to hear your feedback on the site. This is an evolving project, and we already have a lengthy list of enhancements that we're planning for version 1.1. And we're also interested in the potential of this format as a new kind of vehicle for public scholarship in other arenas. And your feedback will be crucial to helping us develop that mission. Finally, we're funded by a broad and engaged coalition, and we're very grateful for their support. I also want to acknowledge a couple of people in the audience, my colleague Adriana Di Silvestro, who, at the back, who handles the day-to-day operations of the website, and Christella Trump, who is our first program director before taking a tenure-track position at the University of Memphis, and both have been instrumental to getting where we are now. And with that, Mike and I are happy to take any questions that you might have about the site. Our literature reviews tend to be focused on academic publication, but we have space on the site and abilities to sort content from any number of streams. So our news content features everything from job openings to research briefs and white papers and book announcements and events. So we're open to any content that fits within our very broad remit of helping map contemporary research and disinformation. And we're also interested in helping to historicize some of these problems as well, which is something that Mike has been engaged in another set of projects.
Yeah, I think, I was speaking with someone right before the program started, and if we agree that the threat to democratic discourse is real, I think we have to also come to terms with the fact that we need all hands on deck. And it won't only be academics who are contributing to our knowledge. Oftentimes it's journalists who are doing rigorous forms of either data analytic research or fieldwork and asking questions where it's really hard to get at quantitative data. And so, whether or not something makes it into a literature review, as Sam suggests, does not mean that it shouldn't or couldn't be featured on the site. And we really want to take the opportunity that we will have to amplify a lot of different kinds of research and knowledge on this topic.
When I looked at the site this morning, we're currently on the homepage aggregating content from Bellingcat, from the Wall Street Journal, from the Center for Security Studies at ETH Zurich. So that's a sample of the type of content that we have available on a daily basis. Yes? In terms of, let's see, we started curating content with MDN about 18 months ago. Yeah, so our news content goes back for about 18 months. We are backfilling the scholarly citations, and we have a little bit more work to do there, but I think we're fairly comprehensive going back to about 2014 currently. So we're focusing on more recently emerging research, but we have some foundational material from the early 2000s as well.
I'll just add to that. Unlike the kind of literature review you might find in an academic paper or in a dissertation or in an academic book, our goal is not to cover everything that's ever been said about disinformation, right? Our goal is to stay very current. So, as this space evolves, things that we knew about the mechanisms of dis and mis and malinformation are not necessarily relevant anymore. And so the live research reviews, right? They're called live research reviews for a reason, because we do want to be continually iterating these and bringing them up to date, so that when you log on to, when you arrive at MediaWell, that you're getting the state of the field as it exists.
Yes.
Hi, it was very intriguing. Were there any models you used as you were building this site?
This is completely new stuff. Nobody's ever done this before.
What did you build it on?
It's on a.
It's built on WordPress. Our content aggregation runs through a plugin called Press Forward. And we use Zotero to manage our citations database. And the way that works is that our Zotero content syncs back and forth with the website. So as we upload citations either to the site or to Zotero on a daily basis, those sync back and forth. So both are publicly accessible. Content aggregation is certainly nothing new, but I think this style of content aggregation merged with an academically focused set of topics and research reviews, that I think is new. Yes?
Again, this was really great. I'm really excited for this. I just had a question on academic work. Is it just the abstract you're making available, or are you able to get the PDF?
So we can't, for a variety of reasons, break paywalls. We have the abstracts on the site so that we can make those searchable. On each citation entry, there is a link that will take you to that particular publisher or journal webpage. In our FAQ, we have some suggestions for how people can access preprints through things like SSRN or Archive. So we are trying to point people to content so that it's usable for them. But again, we run up against this paywall issue.
I think we probably have time for one more question, if there is one. Oh, there's two. Yeah. We've got, we'll take you. We can take both, I think.
I have two related questions. It might be useful to have a section on journalist perspectives. I mean, I realize that this should be a literature review of academic publications and presentations, but I'm thinking about those pieces that journalists try to do maybe once a week that look at fact checks. And fact checks can be accumulated over time to try to get a better understanding of public pronouncement, candidate pronouncements, and the fact checks on that. So it would be interesting to see how you're handling that, or if you think the site would just be overwhelmed by the number of these fact checks. So that would be one question. The second would be, this is not totally new to academic fields, and there has been kind of a theoretical and a research foundation that we build on the role of information and how framing can change public attitudes. And I wonder if there might be an academic area in which we look at the foundations of the theory on the role of information and disinformation.
Mm-hmm.
It's not these are just two related questions on different parts of your site that might be helpful to think about the future of this field that you are still developing.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I think that's, how we integrate content is something that we're going to have to think about as we get out there in the world and people give us feedback. But I know that already, we are. There will be a literature review, a live research review, for example, on mitigating misinformation, right? And thinking about the kinds of interventions we, either as journalists or as academics or as policymakers, are making in order to stave off the onslaught. But I think what you're suggesting, kind of weekly updates on what's going on in the world of fact checking. I think the way that, and Sam may want to say something else about this, but I think the way that we're going to deal with the kinds of iterative content that comes in on a weekly basis is to feature things that other people are saying. And to the extent that we're producing content, it'll be largely through our expert reflections, which will come out on a periodical basis and may speak to that or may speak to some other anxiety of democracy.
Yeah, we've had conversations with one fact-checking organization already about ways that we can amplify one another's content. But again, we don't want to distract from our overall mission of presenting academic material, which is where our expertise lies. And then in terms of the theoretical foundations, I have to keep the literature reviews as short as I can, which is always a struggle, but I do try to nod to the foundational literature and direct people in footnotes to places where they can find other material. And also, I try and incorporate some historical examples. So we remember the Maine, for example, in one of our research reviews.
I think we had one question in the back, so yeah.
Congratulations to you. I'm just curious about you may have already said this, but in subsequent updates, are you anticipating the use of material in languages other than English?
That's a great question. Yes, we hope to be able to extend this both in terms of other languages and also to make sure that we do recognize that these are global issues, and we want to make sure that our content reflects that in a variety of languages. So that's something that we started talking about very early in the project, and now that as soon as this launch is in our rearview mirror, it's something we'll be returning to very soon.
And I'll just add to that and kind of put a pin on something that Sam mentioned in his presentation. We are going to work as hard as we can to make sure that we are citing all of the relevant content, but we will be able to do that better to the extent that people get involved, either by becoming editors at large or just by emailing us the things that you think that we should be writing about, right? Just give us a flag. Say, I happen to read in Spanish or in Chinese, and I know that this is something important, right? And put it in front of us so that we can amplify that work.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And I think that we'll be cleaning up the projector as well. I think we have no more need for it. But good morning and welcome, everyone. Again, my name is Jason Roady. I'm a program director at the Social Science Research Council, and I lead the MediaWell project, the Media and Democracy program, the Social Data Initiative, and a few other projects and initiatives at the council. And I have three very quick tasks this morning. One, I have to add to the round of thanks that are going around. Second, I want to tell you a little bit about the other activities at the council that are ongoing and how you might become involved in those activities that might be relevant to the work that we're talking about this morning. And then I want to most especially welcome what is the highlight of this morning's program, which is our esteemed panel chair, Julia Angwin, who will introduce the remainder of the panel. So first, a round of thanks. We're very grateful, first of all, to you for joining us here this morning on a slightly drizzly Washington, D.C. morning as we launch MediaWell. We've been obviously working on it for a while, and we're especially thrilled that we can share it with you first. We're also grateful to our funders. Sam showed that slide, but I think it bears repeating just the coalition of folks who've been involved in trying to bring this together. And I think largely because they all have been involved in this space for, let's say, a couple of years more aggressively than others, and recognize the need for this very sort of platform. So that involves the Hewlett Foundation, the Democracy Fund, the Ford Foundation, the Knight Foundation, the S.D. Bechtel Jr. Foundation, the Rita Allen Foundation, and Reid Hoffman. And we're especially grateful to all of you, especially those of you who are in the audience, for all of your work. Many of you have been longstanding partners to the Council. Some of you are very new partners in our work, and we're very appreciative of your support. So we're also grateful to many who have contributed to the production of MediaWell. I encourage you, I won't go through the entire list of names, but there's an About section where we really list out many of the folks, including journalists, scholars, policymakers who've been involved in reviewing the site and giving us feedback, and additional council staff who've been involved. I want to also thank the advisory committee, who has been especially productive in this work and will continue to do so. Dave Karp is here, I believe, in the back. So we're very thankful to them. We're also grateful to Christella Trump, who really led the charge of this initiative for many months, and we miss her daily, but we're very glad that she's here today. Mike and Sam, very grateful for that work. Sam and Adriana, though, I just have to repeat, they've been working at this nonstop for the past several months. They've done a tremendous job bringing the platform and its content to the point where we can share it with the rest of you, and we're really grateful for their work. So, MediaWell, though, is just an important part of a larger cluster of activities at the Council that sit at the intersection of media, technology, and politics. And the themes at the heart of MediaWell, so disinformation and misinformation, algorithmic integrity, election interference, and wedge issues such as ranging from climate change to racial and ethnic tension, resonate in other SSRC media and democracy work. And also the principles at the heart of MediaWell are reflective of the broader mission of the Council since our founding, to bridge across disciplines, to curate the latest knowledge and information from the best available sources, and to help bring that knowledge to bear on contemporary issues that require informed policy. So two other SSRC programs are particularly relevant to our topic today. First, our social data initiative that recognizes that complex social, cultural, economic, and political processes that govern our lives today and our decisions all now occur online, or largely online. But access to the data that is relevant to that activity is now largely restricted to private companies rather than in the hands of researchers who can make sense of them and policy makers. So social media technology companies and the platforms that they provide are central agents, however willing or unwilling, in the modern spread of misinformation and disinformation. And for the past 18 months, as SSRC has worked with foundation partners and social media companies in order to provide access to data through a peer-reviewed mechanism that protects the independence of the research. So some of that data has been made available, but it's also clear that companies continue to struggle to provide data access in a way that is both privacy protecting, but also broadens our mutual understanding of how social media impacts our elections. So the Social Data Initiative works on the assumption that there must be multiple pathways to access and use proprietary research data. That can be direct engagement with companies, but it could also be through continued development of research and data collection methods that are independent of those companies. Panels of individuals who share social media data with researchers, scraping data and other techniques, plus surveys and experimental research design, and most importantly perhaps, robust ethnographic and qualitative research that capture the impact of social media on everyday lives and historicize and contextualize that work. So I invite you to follow along with the Social Data Initiative over the next coming months as we continue to build out that part of our work. And finally, the social science, the SSRC Media and Democracy program, which encourages and catalyzes academic research, practitioner reflection, and public debate on all aspects of the close relationship between media technology and democracy. So for the past few years, we've gathered scholars to map out the research landscape, resulting in reports authored by Christella and the rest of our team, Social Media and Democracy, Assessing the State of the Field and Identifying Unexplored Questions back in 2017. And we host a number of competitive workshops to help accelerate research, exploring how innovations in media technology affects democratic processes and practices. And importantly, to put those practices in historical and cultural context. So recent workshops include one on digital threats to democracy, which sought to possible remedies to disinformation by looking outside of the United States to countries who have been grappling with disinformation campaigns for much longer than maybe we have. And we've also recently explored historical context of media technology and democracy through the study of, say, historic newspapers and journalism in the 1930s and 40s, or fake news in revolutionary America, and the history of media regulation in the 19th and 20th centuries. So all of that, if 2 days of intense research discussion sound appealing to you, we have 2 open calls for participation. One on changes to news coverage in U.S. elections, that's asking how have the rise of social and digital media and the decline or evolution of traditional news media reshaped coverage of U.S. elections. And another open call is available on extreme right radicalization online, exploring the processes driving right-wing extremism and the distinct mechanisms by which they might occur online. So those are open calls, and if those are topics that are of interest to you or your colleagues, please circulate that and visit ssrc.org. Both for those calls, but also for summaries of the previous events and videos of some of the lectures that we're attending. So, in keeping with SSRC practice, though, we must always accompany our events, with our research with events that share that research with the public. We're thrilled for this event to give us the opportunity to bring together an amazing group of researchers, journalists, and scholars to discuss the present and future of disinformation in American politics. I'm delighted to introduce Julia Angwin, who's an investigative journalist and founder and editor-in-chief of The Markup, which is a new nonprofit newsroom that aims to understand and translate to public audiences the impact of new technologies on society. Before founding The Markup, Julia was a senior reporter at the independent news organization ProPublica, and from 2000 to 2013 at the Wall Street Journal, and twice she's led investigative teams that were finalists for a Pulitzer Prize in explanatory reporting. We're very happy to have you here. Welcome, Julia. I invite you to come up, introduce the rest of the panelists, and take charge. Thank you.
Good morning. It's great to be here. Thank you for coming out on a dreary morning. First, I'm going to introduce my panelists, invite them up, and then we're all going to say a few words ourselves, and then have a discussion, and then open up for questions. Oh, I have to turn it on. No? Is that better? Yes. Now you can hear me better. Sorry. Thank you for that great introduction. This is an amazing panel of people, all of whom I have followed from afar, but haven't had the opportunity to spend time with as much, so I'm excited to be with them. So first is Brendan Nyhan. He's a professor at Dartmouth College and focusing on misperceptions about politics and healthcare. He was a Carnegie Fellow and a Belfer Fellow at the ADL. He's a contributor to The Upshot in the New York Times and serves as a media critic for the Columbia Journalism Review, or I previously served as a media critic. That's a little scary for me as a journalist, sitting next to the media critic. Nyhan received his PhD from Duke University Department of Political Science. And he and I actually are both Bay Area natives. He grew up in Mountain View. I grew up in Palo Alto. So we both were raised in the belly of the beast. Next up is Ambassador Karen Kornbluh. She's a senior fellow and director of the German Marshall Fund's Digital Innovation Democracy Initiative. This is a program that works to help shape a future in which technology strengthens rather than undermines democratic values and contends with technology policy issues such as the challenge of online disinformation. She's had an extensive career of government service. I think I said to her when we met out there, I said, you worked at the FCC 300 million years ago. But at a time that I was covering the FCC, just to be clear about how we were both involved. She was most recently policy director to Barack Obama during his Senate career, and in the Obama administration, she was ambassador to the OECD from 2009 until 2012. And finally, Amy Mitchell. She's the director of journalism research at Pew Research Center. An extremely depressing job. All of her research is extremely depressing. She is responsible for their research relating to news, information, how the public accesses, engages with, and creates news, what news organizations are providing, how technology is changing, all of it. Prior to Pew, she was a Congressional Research Center Associate at the American Enterprise Institute, where she researched public policy and the relationship of the press, public, and the government. So why don't you guys all come up? And we're each going to take about 5 to 7 minutes and talk about what we think is going on with the state of disinformation. The idea that we have to have a panel to discuss the state of disinformation is already extremely depressing. So I'm going to start with just a few words about what it looks like from my vantage point as a journalist. As I said, I grew up in Silicon Valley. I started programming in 5th grade. My parents worked in technology. It was the personal computer revolution. So computers had just gone from like the size of the table to, nice big box that you could have at home. And I honestly thought that there were 2 career paths in life: hardware, software. And I was obviously going to be a software person. I went to college, University of Chicago, studied math. They didn't allow you to study computer science because that's a trade. I worked my summers at Hewlett-Packard, but I just fell in love with the college newspaper and decided to rebel and go into journalism. And I had a good, fun couple years of rebelling, working actually in D.C., covering the Hill for this long defunct newswire called States News Service. But around 1996, the San Francisco Chronicle realized that I knew how to use a computer and hired me. And so my career really rocketed because people realized that there was somebody who had journalism skills who actually understood technology. So I went from DC to San Francisco and basically covered Netscape, Microsoft, all of those guys. I, like everybody, I think, of my peers at that time, had only the most positive views of what was going to happen next. I felt like it was really exciting, and there have been really exciting things. Like, it's a lot easier to buy an airline ticket. I still remember you had to call all the different airlines, and then when there was one site where they were all on. But it also has obviously, led us to a place where we have to have a panel on the state of disinformation. And so I feel like just yesterday, just think about what happened yesterday. I think it was one of the New York Times reporters tweeted out a list of the top stories on Facebook that were trending yesterday. And they were all, it was Ben Shapiro, Donald Trump, Breitbart, and the Daily Caller, all of whom, if you check the fact-checking sites, are repeat offenders when it comes to spreading misinformation. And those were the top stories on Facebook. And Facebook has been in DC every day, including I think today, testifying about how they're going to improve and they're really trying, and it's a difficult problem. And it just feels like but it doesn't feel like there's any end to this tide. And, at the same time, it's also just worth noting that the most popular news channel remains Fox News Channel, which is also a repeat offender on all of those fact-checking sites. And at the same time, so that's the state of things that are not true. And then when you think about things that are true, which is really, I would say like newspapers, they are declining massively, right? So the newspaper industry is in a state of, I mean, I think you could really just call it a complete collapse. We've lost 1,800 papers in the U.S. since 2004, including more than 60 dailies and 1,700 weeklies, according to Penelope Abernathy's depressing research at UNC on news deserts. And there are an increasing number of news deserts out there. And the places that lose newspapers the fastest are those with the most vulnerable citizens. They are older, poorer, less educated populations, who are then, of course, targeted with misinformation. So I feel like where we are at is fake news is trending, real news canceled, right? So it's kind of it's a difficult situation. And I guess I'm not a policy wonk, but I have covered this industry long enough that I have some thoughts on why we're here. So I'm going to put out my 3 thoughts, which are going to probably seem naive compared to the true experts, but I'm going to give it a shot. So my feelings on why we're at this part of where we're at is 3 things. One, just very simply, we have, disrupted the creation of propaganda, just like Silicon Valley disrupted so many other things. It's now really cheap and easy to create propaganda and distribute propaganda when it wasn't. I mean, remember during World War I and II, right, U.S. and actually every other nation spent tons of money distributing leaflets from planes in order to distribute propaganda. So it used to be really expensive to be in the propaganda business, and it's literally just not anymore. And so that's sort of one really obvious reason where we are. But then the question is, why is this propaganda spreading so fast? And that, I think, is a very simple question, which is that basically it spreads through these social news networks, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Reddit, and it's they all claim to have some algorithms that sort of take care of some parts of it. But the truth is that they have no legal liability for this content, right? Section 230 of the 1996 Telecom Act gives them immunity for third-party content on their sites. And so in the end, if you don't have to pay for the legal fees to defend the content on your platform, that doesn't give you a huge incentive to deal with it. And it's worth noting, I think most people in this room know this, but newspapers actually do have to defend all the content in their newspapers. So if an advertisement is incorrect, the newspaper itself can be sued. Similarly, a letter to an editor. So newspapers have always had, the industry I come from, like this incredible amount of fact-checking and liability for everything that they publish. And it's a really unfair playing field for news when the people who are now distributing news don't have that liability. And then finally, the question of, well, why is the news industry collapsing? There's a lot of reasons. Obviously, they all had local monopolies that they could, charge high prices for their ads. But I think that it's also worth talking about the fact that the surveillance economy is really one of the instruments of destruction for news. And what I mean by the surveillance economy is, I mean very simply the idea that a third party advertiser can track your movements as you go from website to website across the internet. What that means is, when I worked at the Wall Street Journal, the reason they made all their money was because if you wanted to reach pretty much a white guy who golfed and had a BMW, you had to buy an ad in the Wall Street Journal, because there was only a few other places. You could maybe buy Golf Magazine, but there were just like a couple places you could find that guy. What this tracking means is you don't need to find him on the Wall Street Journal. You can track that guy as it goes around the internet. And in fact, the best place to buy an ad for him is not when he's engrossed in some interesting news on the Wall Street Journal, but actually when he's reading his sports scores and sort of like a little more distractible with an ad. And those ads are much cheaper. And so essentially that has meant that no news organization can support its transition to digital. They cannot monetize their audience online. And so that's the simple fact of why news is collapsing, because people want to read online, but the companies can't monetize online. So that's my analysis of what's going on. I'm sure there's a lot more at work here. Just briefly to say what I'm doing about it. I have just left ProPublica to start this new newsroom called The Markup. And it's a nonprofit, data-driven, investigative news outlet to focus on the impact of technology on society. I have two kind of really big goals for the markup. One is I want to increase trust in the news product itself. And by the way I'm doing that is half of the newsroom is data journalists or programmers, and half sort of more traditional journalists. And so the idea is our news gathering will be as data-driven and scientific as it can be. It's never going to be academic level, but basically at a really low level, what I'm trying to do is increase the sample size of a news article. Currently, the minimum threshold for a news article is 3 anecdotes. If I can get it to double digits, that's a win. So that's my goal on the news content side. On the monetization side, it's a nonprofit newsroom. We're not going to have ads, but we have a very special promise, which is we will not expose our readers to third-party tracking. So we have to build all sorts of cool stuff. We're building our own alternative Google Analytics at the moment. And so we aren't going to sort of monetize our users' data. They're going to feel safe with us, hopefully. And we hope that will inspire some loyalty and donations to our site. No, we're not going to have subscription, but we're going to probably be like The Guardian, where it flashes at you like, please feel guilty and donate. So we're going to be tackling a lot of the questions of the disinformation age through our reporting. And so that's what I'm bringing to the table here. I'd love to hear from our panelists. If you want to start, Karen.
Okay, great. Thanks. I just want to commend SSRC for this great and the funders. I think MediaWell is just going to make a huge amount of difference. I even as somebody who lives this, reads about it all day long, it can feel like the disinformation studies are like nutrition studies. That should I eat more fat or less fat, or meat or not meat, and you can't make sense of it. And to have the SSRC making sense of that academic work and distilling it and providing write-ups of it is just going to be invaluable. And I'm really hoping that the work that policymakers like we are doing can interface with that to make sure that when people are reading about the disinformation, they can understand how that dovetails with the legal and policy research as well. But I just want to commend you on it. I think it's fantastic. So my background is I've been working on internet policy since the old days. I think back to when it was called the Information Superhighway. And I was at the Federal Communications Commission, as was mentioned, 300 million years ago, and quite literally. And then I was at the Treasury Department as the representative to what was called the Magaziner Task Force in the White House that came up with framework for regulating the internet. And I won't go into a lot of detail about that now, but on the one hand, it was light. It's been described as light touch. I've described it as light touch. But it is a policy framework. We made policy choices. Some of it was not light touch, the pieces that had to do with the communications network and making sure that things could attach to the underlying telecommunications system. That was not light touch. That was pro-competition and quite interventionist. But there were policy choices made, and while I think all credit goes to the hardware designers, the software designers, the people in their parents' garages, I think we have to also admit that there was a policy framework that made the internet possible. But those were heady days, I think, of techno utopia, where we thought that this network was going to be unlike all other information networks. It was going to give voice to the voiceless forever and power to the powerless. It was going to bring democracy to the Middle East. And it would just always be that decentralized kind of network. When it was mentioned that I was ambassador to the OECD, this was in 2009 to 2012, we sensed that the policy framework was fraying, and I worked with people in the administration, and we promoted a set of policymaking principles that would encourage governments to pursue new policies that would deal with consumer protection and privacy and so on, but within a framework of human rights and free flow of information. Countries didn't take us up on that, and I think it's now becoming really clear, as Julia outlined, that the policy framework is completely out of date for the network that we have today. The internet has completely changed. There are now a handful of companies on which we consume a significant portion of our news. political advertising and debate, and media narrative. And their algorithms, not only are there few companies, not only do we get so much from it, but their algorithms, this is fundamentally important, their algorithms filter our content. So from this decentralized, everyone can be a publisher, everyone's an author, we're now really in a very centralized environment. And, when you listen to Mark Zuckerberg's talk last week at Georgetown and listen to other social media companies, they are still in the old world. They still contrast the open internet, which they think they represent, with the media gatekeepers of old. But the truth is they are the new media gatekeepers, but they have none of the obligations of the old media gatekeepers. So as a result, our politics take place in this digital ad delivery machine that's too easily manipulated. So if you just look at the Senate Intelligence Committee report that came out recently, it reminds us that the Russians created affinity groups. They created groups online like Blacktivists, the Tennessee GOP, Heart of Texas, that organized grassroots events, created networks of organizers. They created real and fake influencers, content. They shaped news conference and coverage, and they created this false sense of consensus. And then they did voter outreach that suppressed votes, especially in the African American community. And it was, they could just push the dials on our political system. So how could we respond? Well, candidates or public health officials or climate scientists could launch their own digital AstroTurf campaigns to combat the disinformation, creating an information arms race. But grim as that would be, it still wouldn't be a fair fight, because the algorithms that I mentioned before, they favor causes and candidates who smear their opponents and amplify baseless conspiracies. So it's not a level playing field. Even if we had the truth and the not truth fighting it out, the not truth has an advantage. The algorithm design juices the incendiary over the informative because it wants to keep you online. And it's also very opaque. There's an opaque machinery that allows the creation of this antisocial capital and radicalization. It undermines the ability of citizens to form interest groups and negotiate coalitions. It corrupts the marketplace of ideas, and it undermines the information voters depend on to exercise their franchise. Not a big deal. You can tell I don't feel strongly about this. So we can get into more about what I think a regulatory regime would look like, but I don't think anybody's talking about going back to the fairness doctrine and having a ministry of truth. Like, that's not what this is about, much as the paper tiger would have you think that. I think the idea is, let's go back to some original principles of media regulation, of what the internet was supposed to be. What would those be? Transparency, user control, accountability. You can just really group the big policy proposals in there. What would transparency be? Political ads and bots would be clearly labeled. Watchdogs would be able to say who's trying to influence you, which in the Citizens United majority opinion, that's what they thought the internet was going to provide, pure transparency. You could have after-action reports. Why is it that what we know about what the Russians did in 2016 is because the Senate Intel Committee made Facebook and the other platforms give over data? If an airplane goes down, there's a black box flight data recorder, and the government gets access to that data so they can figure out what went wrong, how do we make it more safe. So transparency for sure. User control, shouldn't you be able to decide whether or not your personal information is used to micro-target you or run experiments on you? Accountability. Obviously, journalism is a huge part of the accountability. We need government to have data to have accountability. One of the things that we've thought about is, what would a PBS of the internet look like? How would we tax to create a fund? How would that money be allocated so that journalism was independent? New Jersey has a great example that they're working on. So we can go into this in a lot more detail. We can talk about Section 230. Pros and cons. But I think the idea is that American lawmakers have long recognized that, and the public, that an information chokehold poses to democratic self-government. And we've passed policies, we've had standards in the past, and I think it's time that we really acknowledge what the internet has become and worked on a new policy framework.
Great.
All right. Good morning. It's great to be here. I want to echo the thanks to SSRC for this initiative. I'm currently writing my third and fourth literature reviews in this field, so I look forward to handing this job off to all of you and no longer needing to write them. So that's wonderful. And the work on Social Science 1, I think, is really important, too. So thank you for that. What I want to do in the time I have is just try to set the scene a little bit for where we are and why we're here and what I think some of the key challenges are. I want to specifically focus on the transition. You know, a lot of what we've been talking about is the pre-internet to internet transition, and what I want to think more specifically about is this 2016 to 2020 transition that we're currently in. I think it's fair to say that everyone was caught off guard in 2016, and that subsequently there's been an effort to try to figure out what happened, why, and how we can prevent it from happening again. I think there's a consensus that we should avoid repeating the mistakes of 2016, but at the same time, there's a danger of overlearning the lessons that people think we should take away from that election. So I want to add some perspectives from research about what I think we know about 2016 and what the threats really are, and how that might inform the choices we make going forward. So I think the first big challenge here in the post-2016 era is really being specific about measuring the problem. Okay, so this is an area where the measurement is quite terrible, and the numbers seem very scary. So social media, you will see many statistics out of context saying this got 1,000 retweets and this had 50,000 views. And all the numbers sound big, and people kind of lose perspective on what those represent in the scope of the information flows that Americans are actually being exposed to. Right? The volume of content on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube is hard for us to get our minds around, and it's very easy to hear these things out of context and think what everyone's seeing is fake news, what everyone's seeing is extremist and false content. And that's not true, and we need to get a better handle on who's actually seeing it, right? Because and how much of it they're actually seeing, because that really shapes our understanding of the problem and what we should do about it, right? So let me give you an example. If it were the case that swing voters were overwhelmingly seeing fake news, that might support the stories that people have told since the 2016 election about how fake news swung the election, right? People supposedly, voted for Trump who wouldn't have because of fake news. Okay, so that's a story people have told. Okay, so what happens when we look at the data? Well, the best data we have, including some research that my co-authors and I have worked on, shows that it was actually a relatively small percentage of Americans who consumed most of the fake news. So-called fake news. We don't have to argue about that term. Untrustworthy news content. The folks who saw that already had heavily skewed information diets. Okay, they were overwhelmingly from the people with the most conservative news diets, given the composition of the untrustworthy news content that got the most circulation in 2016. Given that, it's quite implausible that they switched their vote preference from Hillary Clinton to Donald Trump. And I can tell you in our data, almost none of them were going to vote for Hillary Clinton before so-called fake news took off, right? So once we understand the problem in that way, then we have a different kind of challenge in front of us. It's not that everyone is in an echo chamber. Actually, relatively few Americans are in echo chambers according to the best available data on people's information diets. But there are a subset of people who consume a lot of political news and do have these skewed information diets. Okay? Now, they're typically already supporting one side or the other, so we have to be more specific about what the problem might be. Is it the ways that they're influencing the political parties that they're allied with? Is it the effects they're having on the debate? It's not a simple story about swinging elections. It raises the bar for the kind of story we would have to tell about what the outcome might be that we fear. And just to really put a point on this, we found no evidence in our data, which are limited, but I think are some of the best data we have outside of the super secret Facebook data that nobody has. We find no evidence of changes in vote choice or turnout being associated with consumption of untrustworthy news content in 2016. Okay, that doesn't mean it's not a problem, but we need to be specific about what the problem is. Okay, and we need to calibrate our expectations. Okay, why is that important? Well, there's been a kind of moral panic around fake news, and there's a rush to think that our goal should be to eliminate all falsehood in politics. I will submit to you that we cannot have a democracy without false information in politics. I do not want to live in a country where false information is prohibited and someone is trying to make that determination. The countries that have, for instance, more permissive libel laws than us, those are frequently used to suppress speech. If if Section 230 were put a legal obligation on Facebook, the smartest thing their lawyers would tell them to do is take down anything that's even close to the line, right? So there are some very difficult trade-offs here that implicate our values as a democracy, and we have to think really carefully about the threat that this kind of untrustworthy news content poses before we start sacrificing those values. So I guess what I just want to suggest is that this research has to be taken in combination with a larger set of conversations about what kind of a democracy we are and what our values are. And there's a kind of ahistoricism to this whole debate, as if we just walked in and said, the only priority is getting rid of false information. Okay, but that's not actually how we've run media policy in this country. Think of our libel laws, or think of the policy, for instance, that broadcasters must run candidate ads. They must run them. Why? Because we worry that speech by political candidates would be suppressed if broadcasters could refuse to run ads and, for instance, under pressure from an incumbent who didn't want to face a challenger, right? That suggests that there's real reasons to worry about suppression of speech. That's something we've thought about when we've made policy in the past. So even though it seemed really easy to say, well, Facebook shouldn't run false ads, isn't this so obvious, and to dunk on everyone who said otherwise, that's actually a very difficult question. That's a really difficult question. And we need to think about our values and priorities. The research can't answer that question, but it can inform that debate. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. And yes, echo the thanks for having this conversation today. And I think certainly what the three panelists prior to me have shared lays out really how complex and challenging this issue is. And there are so many facets at play that it's really hard to figure out the answers or the path, let alone the number of elements that are just in the picture. And so having MediaWell and others that are really working to sort of pull the conversation together is super helpful. I've been with the Journalism Project since it's launched in '97. And so the areas of research that we've been and the questions we've been exploring have certainly changed over the years and had different areas of focus. I would say they're not all negative, although there's a fair number that are negative, including the newspaper industry data that we've been tracking for a long time. One of the other things we do is try to get the public's pulse and share with the broader community the public's take and sense of big issues, trends, changes that are happening in the country and the world. And one of these has been around this issue of made-up news, of misinformation. And I guess what I'd add to Julia's sort of layout of some of what got us here is that there is, in addition to all of those elements, the fact when you have the vast majority of Americans getting at least some of their news digitally, the ability and or desire for members of the public to be able to sift through and make sense of the content that they're landing upon, being exposed to in some sense, can vary dramatically. And certainly a part of that is the political divides that we have in this country that are very, very strong at this point in time. And then also, one of the things that we learned in some of our research are these other elements that people bring to their digital experiences. And one of the things that was really striking is when we did a study that looked at the ability to distinguish between factual statements in the news and opinions in the news, that there was great differences based on certain characteristics. And those who are highly digitally savvy were far more able to do so correctly, to label these things correctly, than those who were not, who had low digital savviness. Same with high political awareness, same with high trust in the news. So all people that had those characteristics were far more able to separate out factual statements in the news and opinions. And so it just speaks to the challenge that we face when we talk about sort of the exposure and the different types of people that may or may not come across this content and the ability to sift through that. And one of the other things that we've done in our research is to ask the public what their sense of made-up news is, how big of a problem they think it is, and we did this recently. And to share some of the highlights there is the public definitely sees this as a very large problem. It speaks to some, I think, of what Brendan was saying about sort of the impacts that go beyond, just the fact that maybe there's a swing vote or not a swing vote, but these other ways that it can be impacting the country and our democracy. And we have about, half of the public that says it's a very big problem facing the country today, which puts that higher higher than the portion who say that about illegal immigration, about racism, about terrorism. So the public sees it as a very big problem. About 2/3 say that it's getting in the way of Americans' confidence in the government to a very large degree. About half say it's getting in the way of confidence about each other and in the ability of leaders to be able to do their jobs. So that sense of the effect on democracy. We also have half that say that they stopped talking to somebody because they were afraid that they were going to bring up made-up news into the conversation. And so when we think just about the communication, the flow, the confidence in our institutions and the governments, this is clearly having an impact, at least on how the public is approaching and thinking about these things. We also ask them who they think is creating most of it. Far and away, it is political leaders and their staffs that the public thinks is creating most of it. Only about 1/3 said that of foreign actors, that foreign actors create a lot. And so they're putting the sort of that blame for creation more on political leaders and their staffs, as well as activist groups. Those are sort of the top two by far. Members of the public themselves fall pretty low as well. But when we ask them who's responsible for fixing the problem, and there were a number of choices, including government, including technology companies, politicians, that onus to fix the problem fell clearly on the news media. And so they're not saying the news media is creating most of it, but are clearly counting on news media to figure out how to resolve this issue and give them the information that they need, which is quite a challenge for those in the news media to be thinking about taking on. The other thing I guess I would mention is that this question of the freedom to access and publish information butted up against the tension and the concern about made-up news and information is one that's come through very strongly in our research. And in this latest round what we've asked people, there's certainly a desire for action. We have 8 and 10 that say that they think something has to be done to restrict made-up news and information, as well as altered videos specifically intended to mislead the public. They do express some sense of nuance in terms of their understanding, things, reporting that's accurate but one-sided, they would not say should have action taken. And the counter was action taken versus sort of protecting the freedom to publish and access that information. But when we've asked things in a little bit different way, there's also sort of a strong hesitation to have the government get involved in that. More willingness for technology companies to do so. So I think that it certainly shows the tension that exists, particularly in America and the American public, between the freedom to be able to access and publish information and the concern around made-up news. And I will stop there.
I think Karen was nudging me that she wants to respond to something from Brendan, so I'll let her do that before we go on.
Yeah, no, I just want to, I take your point that it's really important to disaggregate the data and really understand what you're looking at. But I would make the same point about the policy. And I think people, and I know this audience would never be guilty of this, but I think some people think that because that the hard work and the sweat goes into understanding the data, and then you can just slap a policy argument on the top. And there's a lot of legal and policy research that I think is really, really important here. And too many people are picking and choosing little bits of policy and throwing libel law here and, this is what the broadcasters did and this is what the news media did. And let me just take this issue about broadcasters not being able to censor ads. That is one small piece of a very regulatory framework that broadcasters were subject to. So that was within the context of the fact that their fiduciary responsibility, completely different from the platforms, was not to their shareholders but to the public, because they were being given access to the public airwaves for free. So yes, they couldn't censor an ad, but they had to label it an ad. They have a legal requirement, not voluntary, to have a public file that says what a candidate paid for that ad and what time slot they got. They had to give them the least unit cost. They had to make their opponent be able to get access to the same cost and time slot for an ad. This is in addition to all these things that we, might look skeptically on, like the fairness doctrine, the family hour, kids' educational broadcasting. And, it's always been true that if it bleeds, it leads, right? You know, local news could have been all murders all night long, but the broadcasters had a fiduciary responsibility to respect the public, put the public interest first. They were regulated by the FCC that could pull their licenses if it wanted to. And so you wound up with a very different, you know, was broadcasting all great? Were there AstroTurf campaigns before social media? Absolutely. But there were these transparency requirements. There was accountability in a way that there wasn't. And as far as the news media goes, news media was not really regulated. So yes, we have very loose libel laws. But the news media took it upon themselves after World War II when they saw how media had been used in fascist countries. And they put together a commission that really looked at how can news media represent the interest and be useful to the public interest. And they put in place a whole bunch of codes and standards that they're not based in law, although, you know, you do have this libel law at the background, but codes and standards that have permeated the news media for a long time that are not considered the backbone of what happens in social media. So I think it's really important to have the legal and policy frameworks at your disposal and take them as seriously as you do the data analysis in general. And I know everyone here would never think of doing anything about that.
Well, I guess that leads to my next question, which is like, just to cut to the chase, like what do people think should be done about disinformation? You've laid out a bit of a framework, but not entirely. I mean, I would be curious to know, do you think that there should be a similar regime for the internet platforms? They're certainly as powerful as the broadcasters, right? And you could make an argument that people have made arguments they should be a public utility, they should be regulated, and there should be a new commission. There's all sorts of different proposals floating around. You could repeal Section 230. You could, obviously, it seems like the lowest possible hanging fruit is that the FEC should, at the very least, have more disclosure around political ads on and requirements around the political ads on the internet, which, because those are right now currently like a carve out from the rules. But I would love to hear all of you maybe give a prescription. I don't know if Amy, you're in the prescription business, but.
So I just talked for a long time, so I'll just throw out a couple of brief thoughts. So I think it's really important that we separate content regulation, sort of ex post content regulation, from sort of ex ante. You know, what are some basic rules that the platforms should follow? And I think we get really tied up in the content business, and you know that's why I try to stress the opacity, you know, the centralization with the algorithms and so on. And that's why, so we have these three buckets that we've been talking about, which is transparency, and that would get at the FEC rules as well. And then we talk about a bunch of user control and user safety rules, and then a bunch of accountability. And you could have think of a new agency in the accountability bucket that would have the platforms hand over data that would be able to audit. When you think of the FTC, they were in charge of making sure that Facebook complied with the consent decree, but they don't have enough staff or expertise. So they had PwC conducting those audits, and we all know that they violated the consent decree. So either the FTC or the FCC or a new agency that really could keep on top of all this. And we can think of analogies to broadcast or telecom. And you're right, telecom is a really interesting, another way to regulate an information network. Or you could think of other industries when you get past the information construct, you know, whether it's, I was talking about Superfund, kind of, you could think about it, environmental, you know, airlines. There are ways that we take our expertise and regulate these agencies. The one thing I want to just say, I can get into more detail if you want, but I don't want to bore everybody. But Section 230 is really complicated because we do have such weak libel laws. So Alex Jones is being sued by the Sandy Hook families, and he may not even, they may not even win against Alex Jones because we have very, very weak libel laws. So it's not clear that if we got rid of 230, that would really get at what we want to get at. So what we've been doing a lot of work on is getting people from the law enforcement world, the internet world, and the anti-discrimination world together to think about how could we update some of our civil rights laws. Are there things we could do with 230 that would get at the kind of hate speech we're talking about without a ministry of truth, which we absolutely don't want? And what could we do in terms of domestic terrorism? So I think there are a lot of ideas about what to do about Section 230. And some say get rid of it and just have the judges figure it out. So, that is an argument. Other people have said we have to do something with our negligent laws. We have to have a code of conduct. That's what we've talked about. So there are a bunch of different options. But I think 230 is sort of, a start of the conversation, not the end of the conversation.
I'm just going to take moderator privilege and just say that no matter how weak our libel laws are, it is a cost, right? Alex Jones has to spend money to defend himself, and I'm in the midst of trying to negotiate media liability insurance for the markup. One thing that's really, really depressing about what's going on right now is most insurers will not insure media anymore. I cannot find insurance, and there are investigative news outlets out there right now who don't have insurance. And so the libel laws may be weak, but they're strong enough to destroy my industry.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Really
So it is a real deterrent because even if you can win a libel case, the cost of defending is really high. So I just wanted to throw that little in there.
It's that unequal playing field
Yes.
between the media and just chatting online, right?
Exactly. So we have actually this idea that we're going to start a section of the markup called Section 230, and other journalists can put their stories there, and that's third-party content. So they're not liable. Nobody's liable. So we could try to. I don't know if we're going to do it, but I think it's kind of a clever hack.
Well, look, I'm a social scientist. I'm not a policy expert, so I'll defer to the expert. The only point I wanted to make was simply that policy in the past has acknowledged these competing priorities. I certainly recognize broadcasters are in a different place than Facebook. What I would suggest to you is that Facebook operates at a scale that is in fact more worrisome. There was scarce spectrum. That is why the broadcasters faced those sorts of obligations. But these decisions were actually being made in a decentralized way. So if ads are taken, say third-party ads that don't have this must-run provision applying to them, so not from a candidate, those decisions to take those ads down were being made in a decentralized way on a station-by-station basis because the networks actually don't own and operate all the stations with which they affiliate, right? So if ads were being taken down, it was on a piecemeal basis, right? Now think of the share of digital advertising that Facebook controls. They can make that one decision for their entire network. That's a scale we've never seen anyone exert power over in political advertising in this country, to my knowledge. I defer to the expert, but I don't think there's a comparison there. So I think we do just have to think really carefully about the trade-offs. I don't have a policy solution as such. I think we're feeling our way towards one. I mean, you brought up the case of the media codes of conduct. Pressure from stakeholders and researchers like the people represented in this room is part of what brought Facebook to the table and has pushed them and the other platforms a lot further than they were in 2016. So these elaborate third-party fact-checking partnerships, many of us in the room have engaged with the teams at Facebook that work on this stuff. So a lot has been done in a kind of parallel fashion to what the media may have done. I don't think that's the end of the solution by any means. I guess the last thing I'll just say is Facebook's scale makes them different from everybody else, right? That is the elephant in the room. If Facebook was 10% of the market instead of whatever percentage they are, which is, it would be a completely different conversation, right? But because they are so massive, everything that happens there, just the stakes are much higher, and they don't face effective competition. And I'd say that's the kind of unacknowledged factor in every policy discussion and every research discussion in this field. And we just have to bring it to the surface and talk about it because it really does shape the stakes in a profound way. When we talk about these things, to a first approximation, we are talking about Facebook, right? Everything else is a sideshow. So I think that's just something that at least can help structure the policy conversation.
I don't think YouTube's a sideshow. YouTube is pretty big.
YouTube now has the second widest reach for news
Yeah.
in the U.S. and so it's definitely in the mix there. Yeah, when it comes in. And Julia's definitely heard the Pew Research Center mantra because we are not in the prescription business. We always say, however, the business we are in is in trying to shed some foundational knowledge through data about current situations and things that are happening in the country and abroad. And along those lines, I do always think it's useful to come back to the public when we're talking about this issue because it's aimed at the public, it's about the influence on the public ultimately, and how things are decided in the country. And if you think about this, the range of what people are exposed to, from the kind of accurate but one-sided news to the misinformation to the disinformation campaigns to the things that are wholly made up, to the public's sense, a lot of that is mishmash. It's hard to differentiate one from the next and even get a sense of the impact of one versus the other. And we can talk about it a whole lot ourselves and try to label them, but how does that come across to the public? And one of the things that we are going to be doing over the next year to try to contribute to knowledge in this area is to launch a study or a project that's aimed at tying together people's news habits, so sort of where their news sources, their flow of news, their attitudes about the news media, to what they have seen and heard about the 2020 election and what they think is true or not true about that election. And so hopefully we'll launch it in the early part of 2020 to the public, but one of the main things we want to do here will be a series of ongoing data collections over the course of the year, but we're also going to be creating a digital tool. That will be sort of the main focus of it, is not so much like a big report that the center puts out, but a tool that hopefully people in the room and folks like you all can find useful in looking at where those connection points are. So I look forward to being able to share that. I'm certainly going to keep the MediaWell folks up to speed with what's going on. But I think generally coming back to sort of how does all of this land on the public and what do they do about it or how do they respond is a really important question to keep in front of mind.
Can I
Sure.
go back on this? I just want to put a point on what you were saying, which is I think what you were saying in part is that, and I think it's an important point, that because of Facebook's scale, it's important that they not do something like censor an ad. Is that sort of accurate?
Yeah.
With your argument?
I find it worrisome to censor at that scale.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think we have to take that to its logical conclusion. I mean, Facebook is not neutral. So you may be asking them to be neutral just in terms of that ad, but their algorithm juices an ad that is more incendiary and more conspiratorial, and it juices organic content that is more incendiary and more conspiratorial, as does YouTube's. And it allows groups to be meeting in secret, and if one of those groups is penetrated by some of this false content, it's super promoted and amplified. So I think the amplification aspect of these companies, and also the fact that they are driven by the desire for ad revenue, you can't just make the neutrality about a given ad in isolation of that overall environment. I mean, in the telecom network, we have this common carriage framework, which says, the telephone network can't determine that you get to speak and you don't get to speak. So we have different policy frameworks that work as a whole. I don't think you can just take the piece that says be neutral about the ad without realizing how completely unneutral the overall system is. And I just think
we have zero disagreements on
but
that.
the thing I do want to pick up also that you talked about is competition. And I think we haven't talked enough about competition and privacy. And those are the big things that are happening on the Hill, in Europe, and so on, in isolation and together. So there's antitrust investigation going on in the Hill to see if we need to rewrite our competition laws. The state AGs are looking at concentration issues. There's a privacy bill that's picking up where California and Europe have left off, that's also on the Hill. And then some people are starting to tie these together. So the antitrust hearing last week said, isn't the fact that there's such a lack of competition mean that I don't have control over my privacy because I can't pick and choose who's going to be more respectful of my privacy among platforms. So those are two incredibly important things. Neither of them deals directly with disinformation, but I think some of these disinformation solutions can be attached to either one of those, and they have implications.
I just want to jump in here on this and just say, like, it would be disingenuous to think that Facebook is not already the largest censorship or machine in the world, right? So they take down content billions of times per year. Their rules about what they take down and don't take down were, until me and a few other journalists leaked them 2 years ago, were not even known. They adjust those rules when they see fit. And they also have just, speaking of the Ministry of Truth, they're setting up their own Supreme Court, like their own oversight board to adjudicate those decisions, so that people can appeal their decision through some opaque process that hasn't been quite described yet, to a panel of people that are going to decide whether it's okay, whether Facebook takes down their content. So, like, the cat is out of the bag when it comes to censorship. It's really just a question of who does the censorship. Right now, we've decided that, like, a private party, Facebook, is somehow better than the government. And that's because we in the U.S. are pretty anti-government censorship. And there's lots of good reasons to be anti-government censorship. But we've never really seen corporate censorship at this scale before. And so it's a very complicated thing. And then one more thing I just want to say also, when you get into censoring ads, until I started writing about Facebook's discriminatory ads 3 years ago, you could place any ad you want. So I went on to their platform and bought a housing ad and said, don't show this to black people. And it sailed through because they didn't think they had to comply with the Fair Housing Act, which says you can't discriminate in advertising. And then they said they would fix it with a magic algorithm. I tested it after the algorithm was, a year later, after the algorithm was supposedly in effect, same ad went through. Then they said they were really going to fix it. And, it's taken them a really long time. So as of September 30th of this year, 3 years later, they say that finally they will have a censorship regime for advertising, meaning housing, employment, and credit ads. You will no longer be able to discriminate on any of the age, gender, race, religion, political affiliation, etc. But that hasn't finished rolling out. So actually, you can still buy those ads if you don't go through their Facebook ad platform. If you just boost a post, you can still buy discriminatory ads. So, like, that fix is coming later, apparently. So my point is, we do want them to censor some things because actually the law requires them to censor those things in those areas, and they're not doing it. And then when it comes to speech, they just censor whatever they want, right? So that's the regime we have right now for censorship.
But can we be clear? I mean, they're not. I agree with all that. Of course, like the housing discrimination via ads is crazy, unconscionable, and should be prevented immediately. But like their elaborate codes and whatever are not making fact-based. The only fact-based censorship that's existing is via the third-party fact-checking partnerships. Everything you've described is not fact-based. It's hate speech. It's images they deem too graphic. It's blah 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 down the list of things. Right? We're here to talk on the factual point. Mm-hmm. Right? The only factual censorship is on the basis of these third-party fact-checking partnership determinations. Right?
Well,
and that's been applied to the news feed. Right? And the question is, the question that's been debated in the last few weeks is, should that apply to advertisements too? Because what happens is if it gets fact-checked, right, the reach is diminished by 80%, they claim. We can't verify that, but they claim it basically disappears once you put that determination on it, right? And that's the only censorship that's happening.
Yeah, they definitely would like to be able to, they have stated very clearly they will continue to spread fake information, both content and ads, right? They would like to have that ability. They say that all the time. It's not their job to fact check information, right?
But the idea of Section 230 was supposed to be much broader than, them deciding what's true and what's not true. The idea of 230 was supposed to be some of the things that you're getting at, some of the values-based, safety-based things, and they're not doing that. So they've decided that so the civil rights community wrote them a blistering letter yesterday after they'd spent countless hours in good faith negotiations. And they said, look, they call out the fact that there was a civil rights audit, but only when it was married with a conservative bias audit, making civil rights, which are fundamental to our laws, fundamental to our values, a partisan issue. And the self-regulatory regime, I try to tell this story of the internet's policy framework, but part of what happened is the internet rose up when we were in this fundamentally deregulatory moment in this country, and part of that meant we thought, okay, the market's going to fix everything, so we don't need regulation. But part of it was technology is going to fix everything, so we don't need regulation. And if we want to represent our public values, either we can make this platform completely neutral, make it a utility, everybody gets, it's not driven by an algorithm that's to further the economic self-interest of the platforms, or we can have it, the content moderation somehow imbued with some values of what would be beneficial to the public. And right now we're in between in this, through the looking glass kind of world.
So we don't have that much time before questions, but I do want to just sort of close out with one sort of thought, which is that one thing that worries me all the time when I'm thinking about this issue of disinformation and misinformation is that the president has weaponized, honestly, the use of the word fake news against the media, right? And so I sometimes worry that by constantly pointing out fake news that may well be, like, as you said, a small portion of what's out there, that we are amplifying and lifting up something that then delegitimizes us. And so I guess maybe this is a very self-interested way to close out before we do questions, but to me, that's one of the existential questions that I think about when writing about this area.
I can add something from research on that point, which is that my students and I, when we did an experiment and we showed people warning that there's fake news out there, they became less likely to see actual false news as they were more likely to see false news as inaccurate, but they also rated legitimate mainstream news as less accurate as well. So they weren't appropriately discriminating. They were kind of applying this in a uniform way. So there is a real fear if it's a small percentage of the content out there and you tell people it's everywhere, it's all you're seeing, that's going to spill over. And I mean, I want to underscore the point you're making about the president. We don't see in the media trust data emphasis or evidence of a decline in media trust. Actually, Democratic media trust is way up. Republicans is about flat. So the actual levels of media trust that are being expressed now are actually higher than before Trump took office. There is a worry about a corrosive effect among the kind of core members of his base who are being told that you can't believe any other source of information. But maybe even a more fundamental problem is just when we're thinking about where this problem comes from, right? It comes from, political elites are still the most important source of political misinformation. Like, Amy's respondents are not wrong in that sense, right? The Russians and the fake news entrepreneurs are a tiny fraction of the misinformation people are actually being exposed to. It's mostly coming from our political elites. And that's, stuff that largely we're handling through the marketplace of ideas, right? Does that mean we're out of time or someone has a song? Okay.
Time for dancing.
That was the NSA piping in. Okay. So I think that's the fundamental dilemma to me. Is it's like we can all agree as a country that hostile foreign actors have no place in our democratic discourse, but the President of the United States does. The President of the United States does, right? And then people have a right to hear what the President of the United States says, right? And if we demand that everything false be taken down from every possible platform, that means that most of what the President of the United States says will not be heard, right? And that can head us in a very illiberal direction. So I just think that there's some really tricky trade-offs there.
Right. Yeah, I think that's that's the biggest challenge is where do you draw the line in what information gets under some sort of regulation and what doesn't, and what makes it into news coverage and what doesn't, and what's considered. I mean, you go back to the whole thing of the fact that there's not a license to be a journalist, and what is a media organization, and all of the digital evolutions have blurred the line, any kind of defining mark on a news entity, even whether it would be considered to be reporting accurate news or not most of the time. So it's a huge challenge, and I think the conversations I hear among journalists in the events that I'm in is just the struggle every day with what do you report and how to report it and what impact does it have on our trust. And I think our data would suggest that trust among Republicans, and particularly conservative Republicans from the news media since 2016, has really plummeted. There's always been a divide there, and Democrats have shot way up. That's exactly right. But that gap has gotten bigger and bigger.
Can I just, on the policy stuff, it's so hard to get into the details in a panel discussion, but on the transparency, I just want to explain a little bit about what I mean, because I think this issue of the decontextualizing and disintermediating of media, of journalism is really, really important. And the fact that we don't know the provenance of the information that comes to us. We don't know if it's a bot or a human. We don't know how coordinated it is. When you went to the newsstand to pick up a newspaper, first of all, the New York Times was in a different place than the National Enquirer. Then you picked it up. The opinion page was separate from the news page, in part because of the liability issues that you were talking about. There's a masthead that says who's producing it and what the editors are. You knew where you could go for their codes and standards, and generally what their codes and standards would be. There's a byline. You knew their sourcing rules. When you see something online, you don't know. Breitbart couches all of their news items really actually as opinion. If you tried to sue them, you wouldn't be able to because they use a lot of woods and goods. You don't know if they have a masthead. You don't know if it's opinion or news. You don't know if it has any codes of standards. It's been there was just yesterday, I think, this bunch of false fake local journalists from Michigan that was discovered. So it's completely decontextualized. So when we don't, obviously this lack of transparency in sourcing and context is important to the purveyors of disinformation, or they wouldn't deploy it the way they do. This woman, Youngmi Kim, at the University of Wisconsin, found these ads that were run by Secure America Now, which is a 501c4, and so its funding was disguised, but it turned out through a variety of tricks, people found out it was Robert Mercer who was funding it. If it hadn't been important to disguise who was funding those ads, they wouldn't have bothered. I think there's something really pernicious in the lack of information about who's paying, what the standards are, and just generally what the source of information is. And that's something that, in broadcast world, that was a very fundamental set of rules about transparency. And I don't think there's any question that would be First Amendment enhancing rather than restricting. So I do think there are some of these things that are not trade-offs. We're told by Alex Stamos or Mark Zuckerberg that everything involves these complicated trade-offs between security and privacy and expression, but I think there is some low-hanging fruit that we haven't bothered with that could really help quite a bit. That's just one set, the transparency set.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and we did some research back in the very early days of nonprofit news, and it was, I think, a 2010 or 2011 study, somewhere around there. But we started getting calls from the state-level AP writers who were like, who are these people that are sitting in the State House? And actually, I guess at that point, there were still some people sitting in the State House during reporting, but they were saying, I don't know where they come from or what this organization is. And so we did a study that was looking at state-level nonprofit organizations, Watchdog Illinois, Watchdog Indiana, et cetera. And one of the things we found, we did these audits of the sites, looking at a number of things in terms of both the content that they were producing as well as the trail of how you could find out how they were funded, where their funding came from. And in many cases, it took several clicks in and going to different sites to try to figure out who was actually funding them. And what we found was that, and then we looked at the content and you saw whether it wasn't sort of fact, a fact versus not fact analysis, but it was about the target. So is the content primarily targeted on one side or the other politically in terms of its orientation? And what you found was, as you did get to the funding, organizations that were funded primarily by a single funder, both on the left and on the right, produced the most one-sided content that tended to be targeted at the other side politically. And so definitely just the question of how does the public understand and even figure out, or who's going to take the time to go 10 clicks in to figure out the funding.
Yeah, and you can't even get 10 clicks in. So Facebook, to buy an ad, all you have to have is a Facebook page. Anyone can set up a Facebook page. There's no authenticity requirements. And so even if you see an ad, you just go to some random page like Protect America and you have no idea what it is. And that's the current best practice, right? So there's not even a way to inspect it. Okay, let's open to questions. Here. Is there a microphone, or are we just going to wing it?
It's fine.
Okay.
First of all, thank you, every one of you. What a fantastic panel full of very thought-provoking ideas. So to pick up on a couple of them. One, Julia pointed out, Facebook is running probably the largest system of censorship that the world has ever seen. To connect that to, Karen, your first principle, transparency, which has become a big buzzword in the industry. And the companies issue what they call transparency reports, which have only the tiniest little sliver of information in them. What should be in the transparency reports? And of course, it's a loaded question from people like me who want real information from them. For example, since we have no idea what Facebook is actually taking down and leaving up, with just a few anecdotal exceptions, should that be in the transparency reports? Second, you talked about codes of conduct emerging from World War II having a very favorable effect on media institutions. Do you think such codes, some of which exist already, would work in the tech industry? And the last thing, what about the duty of care idea that it looks like the British Parliament will pass together with establishing an independent regulator? Does that make sense? Would it work?
I was trying to avoid getting into the details. Those are great questions.
I selected them rigorously out of the 20 I'd love to ask.
So we have to change our mindset, and I think an enormous amount more transparency it should be required, and we can't get accountability if we don't have that transparency. So some of it should be labeling, so it should be much easier to find. You shouldn't have to go 10 clicks in. We have to think about, in the tech industry, they talk about user interface. The user interface right now is for you to, give away as much of your data as possible and know as little as possible. The labeling should be much more intuitive and much clearer about what is the information that you're seeing. And then there should also be information that's available. I don't think many users are going to go to the big database that says who ran what ad and paid for it and so on, but that could be available to third-party watchdogs who could assemble it and tell you Robert Mercer funded, a whole bunch of ads that were Islamophobic, and it would be helpful for the public to know that. Julia could use those databases, but they'd have to be uniform, they'd have to be sortable and searchable, they'd have to have the right information. The platforms would have to have a requirement that's more like a know your customer requirement of a bank than just, set up a page and I'll send you a postcard and if it comes back. And right now their ad database doesn't work. But that's just on ads. That doesn't get at all the organic content and the secret groups and now there's going to be encrypted messaging and so on. And so I think we really have to think about transparency. And again, it totally interfaces in an iterative way with accountability. And I think the self-regulatory model, when you're talking about a platform, platforms this enormous with this much control, just doesn't work. And so I think you need some kind of public accountability, not just, I know there's this, what is it called, Social Science One idea that they're going to give over data to researchers. It's a year later. I'd like to see, much more of a situation where the public, through an agency, can get access to data, and it would be privacy protected, because you don't want the government knowing everybody's posts and so on and who did it. I think that's going to be really hard, but that's what you do through public, rulemaking procedures. And so I think that's, one set of things that has to happen in terms of much more accountability and transparency. As far as the duty of care option in the UK, there are a whole bunch of people that are trying to think through how to modify the libel situation, the Section 230, or they don't have exactly that in Europe, to use negligence laws, and to use the courts and common law. And so I think there's a lot of different thinking going on. The French are looking at it. The British are looking at it. People are talking about it here. And the basic idea is if you just get rid of 230, as we've all said, you're not necessarily being able to sue for the stuff that you really want them to be moderating for. The stuff that we all thought they were going to moderate for when Section 230 was put into place was this hate speech and unsafe activity, and they're not moderating for that. But it's hard to get at that, and have a full respect for free expression. So these are all ways of getting the courts to say, well, you're not negligent if you're doing these kinds of things, or to have an agency say you're going to have a code of conduct that shows that you have procedures and that you're being transparent and consistent. So these are, I can talk about it more in detail, but there are different ways of getting rid of the total immunity without having the government decide what content is okay and not okay. And I think they're all really interesting. And I think we used to say laboratories of democracy with the states in America, that like states would pass things and we would see what worked and decide what should be done nationally. I think that's true internationally now. We have laboratories of democracy with different countries. That was way too much talking, I'm sorry.
Question? This is fantastic. Thank you so much. So I guess I wanted, it's a little bit on the kind of governance crisis sort of regulatory regime question, but it seems like you're offering us, thanks, Adriana, different answers. So Amy's data says that the people, the citizenry, thinks it's the media's job, right? Karen is clearly suggesting that that there are sort of pillars of an existing regulatory regime that we can still use, but this is occurring in a moment of kind of congressional gridlock. Like, we can't get anything happening. So I don't understand. I guess it'd be good to put you and Brendan in conversation. I mean, yes, I think that's true in a former world, but we're living in a world where you can't even pass regulation. And then, Brendan, your data seems to suggest that that it's even a more micro program, that it's about. As a sociologist, it's an interactionalist issue. So is there kind of like some kind of interactionalist self-regulation or communal regulation or communal norms or something that might be at work here? So I guess I wanted to talk about regulation, but maybe a little bit outside of the typical kind of discourse in which we talk about regulation and think about these other sort of sites that you guys are offering us a possibility. Because, we need actually short-term solutions for things that are happening very soon. And I think if Karen is right, even the regulations that we need in the existing regime are years down the road. And so how do we think of these other alternative spaces in society for things we might do?
Can I jump in with one thing, which is that there's a lot of regulatory activity happening at the state level. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of, to me, feels like that the way it's going to happen here in the U.S. is a ground up. And eventually the federal government will have to harmonize some state laws. But that's because it doesn't feel to me like Europe, even though it's a laboratory. What's crazy about Europe is that they've done some pretty bold moves against the tech companies. I think Google paid a $6 billion fine and doesn't affect them at all. They literally don't even change their behavior. And so it's obviously that seems to be working as a strategy.
Well, except that what I would say is that, I agree with you. I think the states are really important. And California's privacy law is a big deal, and a bunch of other states are looking at things, and I totally agree with you on that. But I don't think that Europe's not important. GDPR inspired California. Yeah. And they're now looking at their version of Section 230 and how to undo it, because the publishers are much stronger there. So I think, I'll let these guys talk about the non-regulatory options, but I do think there's sort of a bank shot, which is let's show how this stuff can work. But I think the reason that I feel like it's important to have a policy discussion, even in a policy absent moment, is because clearly that informs how we're going to hold the platforms responsible. And, it's no accident that Mark Zuckerberg felt the need to come here to have a speech at Georgetown to talk about analogy to broadcasters in a way that I think was either disingenuous or not all that informed. So I think it's important to have an answer to that in terms of holding them responsible. And the one other quick thing I'll say is one of the things that I'm really looking forward to is working with some of the science-based interest groups outside of the partisan sphere to try to help them engage in sort of the digital arms race, and then to demonstrate when they can't, when it's not a fair fight. So whether it's public health or climate or gun safety, they're having real troubles communicating to the public because of the disinformation space. I don't think it's not fundamentally a partisan issue, and it may take it out of some of these conversations that we've been having, and again, maybe lead to some policy or maybe lead to some platform action.
Yeah, I think broadening and reframing beyond the partisan divide is a smart idea, and that more progress is possible in the consumer space and other ways of thinking about platform policy. I guess the thing I'll just say is that there's I think there are two big elephants in the room here. Is even if we have these policies, the scale, how we implement them at this scale is unclear. Like there's just so much content that's moving through these pipes, right? Imagine if the phone company, right, every call they had to hang up if you said the wrong word, right, or they'd get sued, right? I mean, that's hundreds of millions of pieces of content, right? So we need innovation in policy models, right? So one thing that might be like you could imagine a kind of audit, kind of third-party fiduciary that could do kind of an informational audit to provide external transparency and accountability outside of or in addition to policy framework. So one challenge we have with Social Science 1 is simply that just to show us very limited data requires this elaborate privacy apparatus under existing law, right? So our privacy objectives are in tension with our research and accountability objectives. And this is nothing even close to seeing the content they're taking down. This is literally how many people shared a given URL. Armies of lawyers have been, fighting about this or doing something for, 2 years, right? I'm sure the people in the room can tell us war stories, but the point is simply that it's, we have a very long way to go, and we're going to have to think about how to create space for that kind of evaluation, because whether it's regulators or just third-party stakeholders that the companies actually want to be transparent to because of the pressure on them, we don't even have a mechanism to know how to do that. And we can tell them it's actually in your interest to show it, to be more transparent, right? I mean, I always make that pitch to them. I say, if you actually showed us the data, in a lot of ways, it's worse than it's not as bad as people think it is, right? People's fears are much worse than the reality. In some of these cases, they think it's all fake news. And it's not great, but it's not all fake news either, right? And in some ways, the transparency might be better, but they're so risk averse that they're just not letting us see it. And the frameworks that we have in place make it really hard to even figure out what's going on. Okay, I'll let Amy talk.
Well, I mean, I would just agree with the point that it is a challenge to even be able to study it from the research perspective because of the challenges of privacy and being able to get the information out. It's a tricky situation, and that there's also so many ways to have information travel, and people that are creating it are also smart and creative, and I can't imagine that there's going to be some way to just have it be in control. There's so many now, whether it's online forum groups, private channels of conversation, that information and news can flow back and forth in ways that are really under the radar. And ultimately, there is a good deal that's going to fall on the public itself to care enough to want to take the time to figure out what's right or wrong, and whether it has to do with getting past the partisan divide or the entertainment element of it, or just caring enough about news. I mean, there's a large portion of the public that doesn't pay that much attention to news on a regular basis. And do they care enough to understand what a flag means, or just be, suddenly think nothing's right and I can't trust anything? We know one of the things that when we ask people sort of how news behaviors have been affected because of their sense of made-up news, a large portion, I think it was about a third, that said that they reduce the amount of news they get overall. Because of the concern over made-up news. So there's definitely a part that the public has to play in being able to reject that which is not the accurate portrayal of events.
This question is back. Yeah, you.
I'll just speak loudly,
Okay.
I think.
Wait, here's.
So you've just started getting into sort of public digital media literacy, sort of how do they recognize it? And I think what concerned me, Brendan, about what you were saying is that it didn't really affect the 2016 election and the Senate report and your own research on that. is that when I teach social media literacy and democracy in graduate and undergraduate classes, what the students notice the most about the Senate report is that it was discouraging people to vote. It was, Russians planting memes or other groups planting memes to gain followers, and just like it's a complicated sort of sequence of discouraging somebody to vote. And I think that the Bolsonaro election in Brazil and Brexit, I think your statement that it didn't really influence elections was a little bit too strong. I think we definitely need to look at it more, but the pattern that I'm looking at is that when students can start looking at memes as potential vectors of disinformation and asking the question of where it's coming from and whose interests are behind it, that this kind of thing is an urgent need before the 2020 election. And if you can comment on that.
Sure. Let me be more precise if I was imprecise, and I apologize if I was. What I mean to say is more precisely is there's no credible evidence that the outcome of the 2016 election was changed. Okay. There were efforts to discourage people from voting, but there's no evidence that those succeeded at a scale that would change the outcome. And I think if you do the math, that bears out. Any ad. Oh, please go ahead. I'm not a Brazil expert. Please send me something if there is evidence of that. But again, it's tricky, right? Because remember what I was saying about 60% of the false news being consumed by 20% of the people, right? It may be that Bolsonaro's followers consumed lots of pro-Bolsonaro information, much of which was dubious. But the causal effect of that, did they vote more, right? Did they turn out at higher rates, or did it persuade people, is a harder question to answer. Right, and so that's the challenge I think that we face. Now, even if it's only reaching these supporters who already follow that candidate, it might be making them hate the other side more. It might be making them, support illiberal policies towards immigration or pro-authoritarian, feelings. Or we can imagine all sorts of stories, but that's a different question than whether it changed the outcome. I hope that's clear.
I think I'd be remiss if I didn't say that there's like a huge... Oh, sorry. I'd be remiss if I didn't just jump in and say there's just a huge obstacle to measurement, which obviously we've talked about. But just one thing I want to really throw on the table is the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which basically makes it a criminal... The Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which means that people like me who do large-scale scraping of publicly available information on the internet can be criminally prosecuted. Maybe that's why I can't get insurance. Anyways, but it's actually a huge obstacle to knowing. And so as much as we say that we can't say that anything happened, we also don't know a lot about what's happening because of the inability to collect data at this scale. And Facebook in particular and WhatsApp in Brazil have technical barriers in addition to the legal barriers that make it nearly impossible. One thing I would point out about Brazil we've been looking at is that there's like, it's not happening as much here. It happens a little bit, but in Brazil and India, one of the things that's the most terrifying is sort of the mob mentality that arises around fake information and mobilizes people. And I don't think it was quite as violent in Brazil as it has been in India, but it's a really terrifying aspect of disinformation that we haven't talked about yet today, but is actually like probably the most human stakes, right? Where people are being lynched because of somebody puts a fake thing saying that they ate somebody's cow or whatever, and then in India they're dead before any kind of fact checking can occur. And similar types of things, mobs were mobilized in Bolsonaro against the people who spoke out against him. And so it's just, even if it is a small fraction of what's going on, it can have really real human consequences. I think you have room for one more question. Yeah.
While the mic is going there, I'll just say, I talked about transparency. The other two policy areas that I think we have to think about, again, are this accountability. And I think the idea that we wouldn't have data on the public debates that we're having because they're happening in these private fora is really something that we have to question, and we can't say that just because it's happening at scale, because there are privacy concerns, that we can't solve that problem. And then the other one, which is user control and safety, There have been a lot of really interesting proposals about how to update our civil rights laws, something like, should we think of these platforms as public accommodations? How do we update these old constructs to deal with some of the Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, racial animus that's being amplified online?
Actually, my query relates directly to what you've just said. This is wonderful, and I think you, and especially Karen, I think everything you've talked about in terms of regulation makes a lot of sense to me. But there's an assumption underlying the conversation that is of some concern to me, which is that the assumption is that somehow the American people were fooled in the last election. And as a historian, my concern is with the chant at the various marches many of us have been to, this is not who we are. What if it was who we are? And I think that by emphasizing the ways in which people were manipulated by social media, which is important, and that's why I agree with all of this, we do tend to perhaps understate a little bit about whether or not, in fact, other than the voter suppression, which I do think made a big difference last time, and we haven't talked about at all, other than that, that perhaps in the states where in the states that mattered, maybe the voters did in fact vote for who they wanted to vote for, and maybe this was and is who we are and were, which is a lot more daunting.
Well, geez, do we have to close it out on that note?
I totally agree with that, and I that's why I'll just, say it's so great that SSRC is involved in this effort, because obviously we have to take seriously the disinformation that's at the heart of American history, especially about race, right? About what the Civil War was about, why we wound up with Jim Crow. And so much of what happened in the election was about race and ethnicity and religion. So this question of who we are, we need these academics to help us figure that out. But I also, or to, nobody's going to figure it out, but to piece it apart. But as somebody who's been in politics, I would also say that you can't really talk about a political election without recognizing what a tiny, tiny percentage of Americans vote. And so one of the things that happened in the Obama administration is, the Obama election, right, is that they were able to change what had been seen as a fixed number, which was African-American participation. What happened in the last election was also playing with some of these participation numbers. We also have the Electoral College, which is a huge driver. And so if you look at voter suppression, gerrymandering, the Electoral College, and the effect on turnout, this is a really, overdetermined set of issues to think about. And I think it's not just a question of, were people lied to, did they believe the lie, but how was the debate polluted and distorted? How much time was spent on her emails? How was the immigration conversation couched? So we need the academics, I think, to piece it apart and help us understand it, in my view.
Let me just briefly recommend the Identity Crisis book by Sides, Vavreck, and Tesler, which is the single best political science book on what happened in 2016. I would highly recommend it to everyone. I do think we should avoid the temptation to attribute all disagreement with ourselves to misinformation, which is something that people often do. And it's often, part of what's being expressed in the polls that Amy described is people thinking the other side is misinformed, and that's a big part of why we disagree. But there are also fundamental values conflicts and things that go far beyond that. And we've done experiments where we could give people factual information and they change their view about some factual point, but it doesn't actually change their policy preference, let alone their party, right? So our disagreements are larger than that. And I guess just to underscore the other point that you brought up, I want to highlight, I'm part of a group called Brightline Watch that tries to monitor the state of U.S. democracy. And part of what makes these efforts so important is that they're in a context where experts are genuinely alarmed about potential democratic erosion in this country. And that's a broader question than just disinformation per se, but that is something that all of this relates to in important ways, and that's something we're tracking there if you're interested.
Okay, well, I think I'm going to wrap this up. I'm going to have to just do a brief defense of facts because I can't leave it in a world where people don't care about facts. And so just as a personal optimist and a person who's devoted my life to bringing facts to the table, and academics and researchers who also do that, I think there's still hope for facts. So thank you.
Yeah, here.
Of expertise and perspectives to sort of grapple with these thorny and difficult issues. What a rich discussion. Thank you. Please join me again in thanking our panelists. So I think what our discussion makes plain is that researchers, policymakers, and journalists need more data, yes, but also maybe more information about the processes and the policies that govern our current media ecosystem. We need to better understand how any information moves between so-called new and old media, and across platforms, actually. And these instances of transmedia migration, where conspiracy theories do become the talking points of political elites, for example. At the same time, as the panel notes, the effects of all of this are really difficult to measure in things like voter engagement. But we are seeing, as they also showed, that there's a significant impact on questions of trust, for example, in core institutions like, news media or fair elections or even research as a whole. So upon which all of our democracy really relies. So the council looks forward to working with all of you here in the audience and exploring these challenges and engaging in robust research to developing sound policies that serve the public interest. Thank you so much for joining us here today, and we look forward to working with you.